Hegel. Hegel just needs the name Hegel. He's renowned in history. He's a shaper of epistemology that has permeated the Western world. And he really needs very little introduction other than to say that he arrives in the midst of this Germanic influence of the Enlightenment leading into modernity that is after the synthesis between the empirical and the rational. So if the Germanic version of the Enlightenment, basically speaking, was after the rational, and the English version of the Enlightenment was basically after the empirical, and Immanuel Kant gave you that great synthesis. Hegel exists within the shadow of Kant as a reaction to Kant, but also a continuing of Kant as giving you this synthesis. In the final analysis, he found himself discontent with the conclusions of Kant, but he wanted to move within those conclusions into something bigger and better, as he would see it. So, let's look at some of these conclusions. First, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that Hegel is above all the philosophy or the philosopher of dialectic. This dialectic was a direct reaction both to Descartes and Kant, but most obviously to Descartes. So he looked at Descartes in his I think, therefore I am, which for Descartes was a delimiting term that meant for him that at least at the very beginning he couldn't count on anything else's existence. Perhaps there's an evil demon deceiving me, perhaps I'm the only one who exists, but at the very least I know with my mind that I exist. I think, therefore I am. And Hegel looks at this, as so many others before him, and offered his own version of a critique. For him, he pointed to the notion of I, and he said, I is a delimiting term. The word I is bounded. It gives you an idea of what's at play, as opposed to what's not at play. I demarcates not I. This was a direct reaction to Descartes. Think about this in terms of the basic functionality of our lives. I'm a professor. I'm a professor means that I have student. If I am a professor but I have no student, then it's a meaningless conversation to talk about me being professor. I'm a husband. My being a husband indicates that I have a spouse. Husband is a meaningless concept without a spouse. I am a father. Being a father automatically indicates having children. Me being a father is a meaningless concept without children. And we could do the same with each of your identities, right? And it goes on and on. For Hegel, these dialectical components live in tension. For Hegel, we're going to see it's a resolved tension, but nevertheless, there's a tension. This tension gives you the dynamic of from which knowledge comes. To say I is to demarcate that whatever the locus of I-ness is, doesn't belong with whatever the locus of not I is. And insofar as there's a not I, we can then begin to identify an I-ness to the not I. And to that not I am the not I, right? To that other I am the not I, right? He's recognizing otherness, and otherness is contained within I. So this becomes an important bedrock for him to be able to think through epistemologically, where he's going to differ from Descartes and Kant, even as he continues on the program. All right, next, duck, duck, goose, or phenomena, phenomena, noumena. For Kant, simplistically speaking, of course, there's a way of describing everything that exists within the framework of the categories that already populate my mind, the default 12 categories. And these default 12 categories are ruled by these intuitions of space and time. For Kant, this means I never quite get to the noumena, but I recognize the reality of the noumena. I can get right up to the edge of it and recognize there's a beyond, right? So if we think about the basic nature of an apple, I have an appearing to me of redness and roundness and juiciness and smoothness and shininess and perhaps even crunchiness, or if you're with my wife, then red delicious apples have sponginess, whatever that means. All of these things contribute as they pass through my basic intuition of space and time and through my 12 categories to help me arrive at this concept of appleness. This appleness is not something I directly know, but I get right up to the edge of it. So I'm able to experience a noumena, reality as it is, unconditioned, through my recognition of a phenomena, reality conditioned. And for Kant, of course, there's an objectivity within the realm of the phenomena to the degree that our phenomena can reach the level of being able to be abstracted from the biases and the locatedness of being embedded within the desires of the flesh. So he carries on that idealistic Greek tradition. That having been said, Hegel comes to him and says, is there more than this? If I can never quite get to the noumena, how is it then that I can recognize the difference between phenomena, from construct A and phenomena from construct B. Think perhaps the difference between John Locke's understanding of epistemology and David Hume's understanding of epistemology. Very similar, both empiricists, both part of this English tradition, and yet they have their radical differences on key points that lead them in different directions. I can look at those things and I can communicate the difference between those two things. So apparently I can look at two sets of phenomena and I can mark the difference between those two sets of phenomena. And what's more, I can mark the difference between those two sets of phenomena relative to how they're able to explain the world. So I can critique them both. For Hegel, this is an indication that I can actually get to more of the noumena than Kant believes, which means for him that he can save a larger function for knowledge than just simply the sorts of things that we would think of, like logic, reason, math, the sciences. For him, this can therefore entail things like the arts. It can entail history, which was a great point of debate in the Enlightenment. It can even entail theology, which is all but dismissed within the modern research university as non-scientific. Right? In the modern research university, you have religious studies, not theology. Theology belongs in a divinity school. Hegel then looks at this and says, I think I can do better. So how is he working? Well, he's working off of certain sets of assumptions, and the first one is one that we could categorize from philosopher and Anglican priest Myron Penner, who describes the modern paradigm of ounce, the objective, the universal, neutral complex of epistemology. In this particular setting, then, the goal of modernity is to arrive at what is objective, universal, and neutral, specifically as a complex for determining epistemologically the right way forward. To put it in short, for Hegel, the goal here and the assumption here is that he can arrive at universal knowledge and he can arrive at certain knowledge, right? The certainty means that I'm sure that I'm there, and the universality means it's true whether I'm here, there, or everywhere. Whether I'm in Chicago or Albuquerque, in Beijing or New Delhi, I can arrive at this particular conclusion. Additionally, there's the notion of meaning and progress. Meaning, in fact, is a presumption for him. So while modernity will eventually dispose with universal notions of purpose, Hegel and many of his contemporaries still operate on the assumption that there is underlying meaning to the fabric of the universe. For the Enlightenment and many moderns, meaning is encased in the notion of progress. Progress then is that declaration of what we're moving towards. If you're thinking in Aristotle's terms, it's that final cause, it's that goal. But here, instead of thinking of a built-in final cause, it's just the goal, ultimately, of freedom. Freedom is the goal of progress, and the realization of that freedom is the goal, then, of what all knowledge is looking towards. Can I truly know in a free way, not delimited by the different things that lead me to my biases and that lead me to the differences between one metaphysical framework from another? So a central motif for the Enlightenment in general is the notion of freedom. Guided by reason's apprehension of our ontological equality, in the name of freedom, societal rules are dispensed insofar as they impede upon individual exercise of freedom. Think, for example, of the American and the French revolutions, which sought freedom from perceived tyrannical regimes. Think about the taxation, no taxation without representation, or various civil rights movements, the end of slavery in the U.S. in the late 1860s, racial equality, which was a big function of the 1960s, 50s to 60s movement in the U.S., or the ongoing recognition of the need for racial equality that's brought forth contemporary civil rights issues, gender equality, more recently gay rights equality, right, or LGBTQ in general. And the growing consciousness of the need for proving the freedom of the will and freedom to think independently of totalizing structures. So think here in terms of liberation theologies, feminist theologies, regional theologies. These are theologies that are meant to say that the theologies that are in place are presuming a sort of objectivism and a universal structure. Now, of course, those belong to a movement outside or after Hegel, but note the ongoing importance here of the notion of freedom. So postmodernity is, in many ways, an extreme manifestation of this concern for individual freedom. It wishes to destroy existing structures that bind freedom and or enslave, including concepts. All right, so as a result, we can then look to Hegel and see the structure with which he's operating. If those are his presumptions, how does his structure continue forward? Well, we can speak first of the structure of history. History is universal, encompassing all the people of the world in all eras. History, at least Hegel's reading of it, screams progress, slowly moving toward its goal, but moving nevertheless. History's goal is freedom. Progress is the increasing realization of true freedom for all. History is the field upon which progress unfolds. History's progress toward freedom provides its eschatological meaning, or the meaning that will be realized in the end times. The progress of history, then, for Hegel, he starts with the ancient Persian Empire. This empire was characterized by monarchy, rule of the one over the many. In this ancient society, one person had true freedom, the emperor or the king. Everyone else lived in accordance with his wishes and laws. The next step forward in history for Hegel came the rise of the Greek Empire. For the Greeks, the basic unit of life was not obedience to the wishes of the king, but rather the good of the polis, the city-state. With this came a shift to at least an early version of what was called democracy, wherein the individuals were not subject to the external compulsion of another. However, while progress toward freedom, the Grecian society fell short of pure freedom, according to Hegel, for people remained under the compulsion of an external, non-rational standard. Think here in terms of the distinction between the free individual civilian who's civilized, who's Greek, versus the barbarian. The barbarian represents outside of this community the failure to reach true freedom, and the goal now was to enact the history of freedom in these places among the barbarian, right? So you're not surprised to find in this particular setting that the movement of Alexander the Great is a move in order to bring freedom to others, even if he is himself a monarch. Well, he moves forward and he continues on. He doesn't stop at the Greeks. He moves to the Romans, where the Romans, even though they have a strong emphasis on law, it's not actually a step forward because individual freedom was championed, at least ideologically. There's a movement where you don't have to be ethnically Roman, if you will, in order to be Roman. Think of the Apostle Paul in the Bible, where he could be a Roman citizen even though he was Jewish. This is a step forward. The rise of Christianity for Hegel brings the realization that humanity's true home is the spiritual, not the physical, so the Latin world signifies a step forward. However, the Christian Middle Ages, this Latin world did away with slavery, carnal ethics, pagan rites, but it did not bring about full and true complete freedom. Both the Catholic Church and really even the Eastern Byzantine Church for Hegel struggled to embody this truth of the superiority of the spiritual. They ultimately only managed to clothe existing earthly power structures with Christian garments. So he looks forward to the next step, which is the Reformation, and the Reformation begins to show us true freedom. Now he moves forward from there to say this true freedom comes through the spirit, Geist, this overarching spirit mind that is his God-type character. And this God character then has a movement is a movement in history of progress. So God is coming, or Geist is coming to self-realization through dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So think creator alongside created, and they wrestle with each other. They struggle until eventually one overcomes the other, and the result is a resolved dialectic where you get a new sort of reality, a synthesis. But for Hegel, each of these civilizations that he mentions represents an incomplete synthesis. So the synthesis has its own new antithesis that it's wrestling with, and the new antithesis and the new synthesis come forward and they give you a new synthesis. And this goes on and on forever until we get finally to the eschatological reality of the end. Knowledge then is a progression of this thesis and antithesis into a new synthesis until finally the cycle ends when true freedom is realized everywhere. Knowledge is the progress of resolution of dialectic and manifest in and through universal certainty and freedom. So when all arrive at freedom as a universal standard of equity, then we truly will have arrived at a place where all of our lives reflect that, and all fields of knowledge will reflect it. Theology will be at its apex, the arts, the sciences, philosophy, history, all these things will join together into an aesthetic society that is joined together. So the goal then of Western civilization for Hegel is to create the world, or is to go forth and export democracy to the world, might be one way of putting it. Think of George W. Bush and his words about the Iraq War, the Second Iraq War. The goal of the U.S. is to export democracy to the rest of the world. This sort of language is important for someone like Hegel, even if it comes after him, because it recognizes the role of bringing freedom to all people, where freedom is in the aesthetic of a particular notion of West. Western is solidified in this dynamic. That was a helpful survey. Talk to you guys later.